So I want to tell you that what you're about to see is remarkable, and that Frank himself is a remarkable man. I don't know if you've seen the video of his work with the Navy, but it's pretty spectacular. He is one of the real originators of appreciative inquiry. He has been with David and Suresh and the crew at CASE from the very beginning, and I think has done some of the most incredible writing about it. Anything that has his name on it, you should read. I see him out there doing this. You should read it, and not everybody gets to hear what you're about to hear. So that wasn't too flowery, friend.
Not bad. Thank you.
All right.
Well, thanks. It sure is a treat to be here and to watch how this group has grown over the last 3 or 4 years. I was part of the regional AIC consulting, and I remember our early meetings back in 1999. I was on a sabbatical over in Europe at the time, and I'd fly over for the meetings. I remember thinking, gee, and there'd be like 15 people in the room talking about, do you think we could ever get a group together and start a movement to bring appreciative inquiry into the business world? And I just remember we put so much time wondering what it would look like. And it's just far exceeded my expectations. It's just a pleasure to see this unfold. And I want to thank everybody how many here were at the Baltimore conference? Would you raise your hand? Okay, great, thank you. So, and it's also great, I mean, it's a good sign that people come back, isn't it? So, and I'm going to be doing the same exact thing, so you can leave now. No sense. So anyway, there won't be the same exact thing. Well, I do want to try and tie together destiny and say that, again, once you have 3 Ds, you have to have the 4th stage start off with a D, right? You can't call it anything else. And we've played around with calling it delivery and whatnot. And the first 3, discovery, dream, and design, all have the advantage of being both a noun and a verb, right? You can discover something and you have a discovery. You can dream something and you have a dream. But destiny on the surface looks like it's stuck. It's a noun. And so I feel like it's kind of my mission to complicate it a little bit. And I don't know, we're going to destine something. I don't know if you can turn, I don't know where to go with it. But you get what I think one way to think about it is destiny is ongoing discovery, dream, and design simultaneously. One of the things we worry about with appreciative inquiry is when we put out books that have stages, is that people actually start to treat it like some step has to happen before something else. So the consultant needs to do this step, then this step, and now we're head to the dream, and okay, we're done with the dream, now we're going to do the design. And that's could kill the dynamic of ongoing learning and discovery. The 4D cycle didn't come into being until about 10 years after appreciative inquiry got started. I remember in the early days at CASE, it wasn't even called appreciative inquiry. David did his dissertation at the Cleveland Clinic, where I also worked with Suresh Srivastava, and I think he called it appreciative analysis. I don't know if Dave, are you in the room, Coop? I think he just called it appreciative analysis because he had done research and he was doing an appreciative analysis of the data. And so I just want to point out that these terms have evolved over time. And the phrase destiny, it doesn't mean that it comes forth. Huh? I mean, because destiny is happening all the time. Does everybody get that part? And I think that's the one point I want to make here is destiny's ongoing discovery, dream, and design, because we're in sort of discovering and learning as we go. Then it's destiny. I want to call back to a couple of the phrases that came up earlier when we were first here. David talked about there may be, he put forth a hypothesis, is there a relationship between deficit discourse and command and control? And then is there a relationship between appreciative discourse and self-organizing? And I want to further that a little bit and say yes. And I want to show you how I think a self-organized system can only work because of appreciative discourse. If a self-organized system, the one I'm going to talk about today, is going to be a metaphor of a jazz band. If they were engaged in deficit discourse, all improvisation would stop. And so I want to kind of show how it's an appreciative mindset that makes that work. I remember the question he asked also, what is it about the experience of wholeness that brings out the best in people? Why is it experiencing wholeness transforms people? I want to put forth a couple small answers to that. I don't think we know, but we can make guesses and little hypotheses. And one part of it is that it's very humbling. So when you see wholeness happen, you see that these things are human constructions, that it's not a fixed thing, that a system is not a fixed thing. You see customers and suppliers and stakeholders in the room making decisions, and all of a sudden, it's like you suddenly realize that God is a verb. And that's a very transforming moment. That happens in jazz all the time, these humbling moments where you realize, my God, we're creating this. So I'll try and expound on that a little bit. I want to point out what Judy Rogers was talking about when she said the relationship between image, action, and engagement. And remember, she said just the experience of observing an altruistic act, like watching Mother Teresa, it elevated emotion in the room. So just watching that created, the notion is if you hold a positive image, if you create a positive image, emotion will be elevated. Well, that's true for jazz, too. They don't talk like that. I mean, jazz players don't read social science articles usually, but they call it groove. And you say when you hit a groove, you feel like you're on a high. And the language sounds very much like that. It sounds like spiritual language. They talk about ecstasy, not the drug, the feeling of ecstasy. They talk about being high and not drugs. Well, at least not nowadays. I mean, in the old days, I think there's a reason why jazz players, 40, 50 years ago were drawn to drugs, because they wanted to continue the experience of the groove. And that was a quicker way to get there. They just didn't realize what some of the costs were going to be. If you notice, some of the great players nowadays, Wynton Marsalis and other great young players, Marcus and other great young people coming up are very, very straight, and they don't do drugs at all. And I also want to call attention to this notion that Bernard and Adrian were talking about around designing. The word sustainability comes up a lot. In fact, they use the phrase designing for sustainability. When we hear the word sustainability, it's often in the context of ecology movements, huh? We talk about ecology as create a sustainable planet or whatnot. The Greek word for ecology comes from ekos. It means household. And in a way, it's interesting with that. How are you going to create the place you're going to live for a long time? This can be the home, your holding environment. And I want to try and connect some of that about sustainability to this too. So you see, I'm trying to do impossible things. I want to also make another comment before I get into improvisation. I think, people are asking where should appreciative inquiry go next? And I talked about this yesterday with Ron Fry, and my partner Ron Fry talked about this when we were working with the Navy case. I think appreciative inquiry needs to get tied into the strategy literature and the strategic management movement. Where I see appreciative interventions working the best is when the issues are strategic issues. That it's not just let's create a cooperative culture, although that helps. I mean, that's nice. But my sense is if you use appreciative inquiry just to create a cooperative culture, it often doesn't sustain as well. If we can tie it as much as possible to the strategic issue that the organization is facing. The topic we have here for the world around creating extraordinary organizations that can, which can work together in a number of ways to make the planet better. It brings together capitalist organizations and universal ideals, as Kofi Annan said. That's a pretty core strategic issue, and it has strategic implications. Well, usually the way we think about strategy is in strategic planning, we use what we call Ron and I have called the DAD model. That means the top, you separate strategic planning from implementation. The top of the organization goes off, and they decide. That's the first D. They get all the information and data. They do the analysis. They know how to do the Porter 5-force analysis, whatnot, and they make the decision about where the organization is supposed to go. And then they come back and tell the rest, and they advocate it, and they sell it, right? That's the A. They advocate and sell the plan, and the others who are receiving it start to question and attack it, because if they weren't in on the early data, they didn't have the same, so they start questioning. So then we reach the third D, then they defend the plan. So they start off, they decide, they advocate, then they defend it. Well, we don't know a lot about the psychology of learning for certain, but there's one thing we know for sure. When defensiveness goes up, learning goes down. So right at the moment when the strategists need to be in a learning posture, they're busy defending. They drive out learning. The DAD model is limited, and that's why I think if we can bring the appreciative inquiry movement into strategic planning, it'll be good for all of us. Command and control systems are designed to eliminate surprise. Well, what if self-organizing systems, if it's truly a self-organizing system, welcomes surprise? What if we created organizations that thrive on surprise? Do we have any idea what they would look like? Is there such a thing as an organization that wants to create surprise on purpose, that wants to throw itself off balance on purpose, just so it's constantly in a state of learning? Well, that's a hypothetical question, and the answer is yes, there are such organizations, and a jazz band does exactly that. The whole purpose of a jazz band is to organize in order to surprise yourself, in order to paint yourself into a corner to see how you're going to get out of it. The notion is, can surprise and discovery become invigorating rather than noxious? In command and control systems, you want to drive that out. Let me just push forward a little bit. I'm going to come back to this last point. I love this expression. I made these slides up, by the way, about a half hour ago, so if it looks like I'm reading them for the first time, because I'm trying to decide who the hell wrote that. Okay. Well, the one says, I'm a driver account specialist. I took that from the presentation was just done with roadway that Cindy did. You know, what is that phrase? It's like a question that's posed out into the world. That's taking strategy away from this notion that it's individual planners. That strategy is a relational phenomena. It's like you let strategists loose throughout the system, and they pose questions. It also changes the way they listen. That's a point I want to make in a little bit, because I love the stories she told. We talk a lot about appreciative questioning. And I think another area I think we as a group could start to look at is what happens to the listening? I'll try to come back to that point at the end if I remember I just said that. So you can feel free to remind me. So it's a system, if we think about learning as, instead of, this comes from straight strategy literature, Mintzberg. We got to get out of strategic planning and get to strategic learning. Well, that means right away that it's ongoing. Instead of, let's tie up 2 weeks and send people off and do the plan. We know the closer we can get strategic planning to strategic implementation in time, the better the execution is going to be. So is there such thing as a system that's formulating strategy and implementing strategy simultaneously? The answer is yes. Very good. Baltimore people weren't listening when you were here a couple years ago, so now you're going to have to stay for the whole session. But the answer is yes. It's jazz bands. Jazz bands are they're formulating strategy and implementing simultaneously. And I'll bring that out in a moment. And I also want to emphasize the inquiry in appreciative inquiry. I think if we really lived a life of inquiry, we wouldn't need the word appreciative in front of it. Inquiry, it comes from the root word from the Latin, and the same root as the word quest. There's a difference between a quest and a trip, right? If you're on a trip, you want to get to Los Angeles. If you're on a quest, you're interested in what happens to you between now and Los Angeles. And Los Angeles just happens to be a detail, right? You're in a learning posture the whole time. And if we lived in a state of inquiry all the time, we probably wouldn't have to emphasize appreciation so much. But one of the things about inquiry is it's ongoing and alive. And particularly, I want to talk about it as a quest of affirmative competence, of building up the capacity. Someone mentioned the article I wrote a few years back on creating an appreciative learning culture. To say the core to an appreciative learning culture is affirmative competence, the capacity to notice and affirm on an ongoing basis. One of the things about improvisation and destiny is one of the reasons I tie improvisation and destiny together. By the way, the word improvisation comes from the Latin word proviso. Anybody here have to take Latin in high school or grade school? I can barely see. Oh, my goodness. Recovering Catholics, all of us? Are we? Yes. The word proviso, Ron Fry always teases me about citing Latin, but if you had to take 4 years of Latin, you would try some excuse to use it, too. I mean, not a lot of us have had to read the biography of Caesar, I assume. I only remember one sentence from all of my Latin. Let's see. Dulce est discipere in loco. Dulce est discipere in loco. I mean, sweet it is to go berserk upon occasion. That's a good one, isn't it? Yeah. You can quote me on that. Me and Caesar, we co-authored that. But anyway, I don't know what made me get on that. But the word proviso, yes. The word proviso in Latin means plan. So when you put the prefix im in front of it, it negates it. Like immobile means to stop, so improviso means you act without a plan. So you're out there acting without a plan. Now, I'll just tell a quick story about, a true story about a group of explorers who were hiking in the mountains in Europe. What's the name of the mountain chain in Europe? Alps, that's a good one. Yeah, it was the Alps. This is a true story, by the way. The Alps. I've actually hiked in the Alps. If anybody's ever, it's an amazing mountain chain, and it's just gorgeous, and especially around the Switzerland and Italian border. And they do come together, Switzerland and Italy, right? Is that good? They were professional explorers. They were hiking, and a storm came on suddenly because the weather can change very drastically in the Alps, and they got completely lost. And their life was in danger, and they were stuck for a few days in the storm. And then when it was clear and they were trying to get out, they realized they were completely lost. But fortunately, one of them had a map, and they were able to get out. And when they got out, they realized it was a map of the Andes. Now, the question is, and that's a true story. Carl Weick tells that story regularly. That's where I got that story from. The question is, why does that work? Why does it work to have a map of the Andes to get out? Well, it's not because it's accurate. It's not because they have a great strategic plan that's going to predict what's going to happen in the environment. It's because it turns them into learners, right? Because this map is an excuse to learn, right? They look at the map and they start going down. In general, they knew they had to go down, I think. But you can imagine what happens to them is they're now processing real-time information on a real basis, and it turns them into learners. They take action, and they compare it to the map, and they say, no, this doesn't look right. It must be this way. No, this doesn't look... And it's much better than staying in place and, saying, gosh, I wonder if somebody's going to come around. You learn by doing with the map of the Andes. Now, the reason I say that is often some of the best moments of learning are when we're working with maps of the Andes. It's not because the strategic plan is accurate, and that's what destiny is about. It's an excuse to learn. When jazz musicians are improvising, they have no score. They're working with a map of the Andes. They're making best guesses at whatever the other person's guessing at and hoping that they can find their way. They're lost in the mountains on purpose. I want to draw a distinction between classical music and jazz music for a moment, because I don't want to diss classical players at all. Classical music is a very creative endeavor. It takes a lot of hard work, a lot of practice. But if you were a first violinist with the Chicago Symphony, you wouldn't show up on Friday night when they're doing Beethoven's Third and say, in this fourth measure, I think I'm going to try a D flat. I'm getting sick of that F sharp. That would not work. The score is printed out. You have a pretty clear map, and you're going to follow that map, or else you're going to be looking for another gig. In jazz, there's no map. Once you get started, you're just off to see. There's nothing written down. Very minimal things written down. I'll talk about that in a second. And by the way, so we don't get too seduced learning about jazz, this is a metaphor. And I want to try and continually bring it back to regular organizations. It's not that unusual. And by the way, when we're done here, if others have examples, I'd like to hear them either informally offline or in the room here. I want to say one other thing about this, because I think often we think organizations are there waiting for an appreciative inquiry, and we're going to come do it. I think I want to challenge that. I want to say that every human system already is an appreciative system, or it couldn't live as a system. Because every human system, there's places in every system that's already spontaneously acting and reacting and inventing as they go. So spontaneity and innovation or improvisation require an appreciative way of knowing, and every human system already is doing that in some way, or else it'll be an entropy and die, or else it becomes a statue and freezes. So our task, I think, as interventionists, is to notice where appreciation already exists, not to bring appreciation into the system. And when we do that, I think we're noticing that destiny is already happening in that sense. The other reason I think jazz is a good metaphor is jazz band's a self-organizing system. There's a tension between chaos and order because there is a little bit of order. It's a chaotic system. Some of you may know the work of D. Hock, who's written about the chaotic age. And the word chaord, is a nice little coined term that brings together chaos and order. Strategy and implementation happen at the same time. They're simultaneous. So you think of something, and it's public, and it's irreversible, and you got to live with it. Your face is out there. You can't. If you're a jazz player, you can't stay too long in deliberation. Gee, should I play that phrase in G right here? And it's gone. They left. The bus left the station, and action and intention are simultaneous. The other quality about jazz bands that are interesting is there's this continual openness to novelty and the quest to discover the best alternatives. And I want to say one thing about alternatives, and to bring out one theme that's in the room, but we haven't talked about explicitly. And that's the importance of comparison. At the root of all learning is comparison. We're always comparing in order to learn, right? You say, how am I in comparison to this, or how's this happening? One of the things about, I think, that appreciative inquiry, one of the reasons I think this is a rich gift we're giving the world, is what we're saying to others is, choose your comparisons intentionally, and choose them wisely. Otherwise, they're going to choose you. Huh? They'll be making the choice for you. So it's a notion, choose your comparisons wisely, because jazz players are always doing, they're always comparing and making notches in their trunk, and I'll say more about that in a second. The other reason is I think jazz bands are a good example of where small actions have large consequences. Once you utter something, you never know where it's going to go, and it usually going to be bigger than you thought. Appreciative system, my example of a perfect appreciative system is a family where they're trying to teach a little kid how to speak. If you ever watch adults teaching kids how to speak, the feedback that the kid gets is an ongoing positive. Every gesture the kid makes is perfect. It's not a problem-solving system, right? You wouldn't stop and say to your kid, no, it's bottle, it's 2 syllables. Can we get that right next time? We went over this last week. You don't talk that way to kids, and because even the most foolish, bumbling gestures little kids make are perfect. We're joyful. Honey, come on out and look at this. He said, "Buh," when we're in doubt of what an ongoing appreciative system looks like, watch families, watch adults in the presence of little kids. Imagine what it would be like as a problem solver. If we lived in families that were engaged in problem solving when we were learning to speak, we would all be dribbling idiots. This is often a question I use. I do workshops, full-day workshops on improvisation. I'll just throw this out as a question you want to think about yourself, because this is what happens for jazz players. Just think of a time you found yourself in a radically unfamiliar situation. You had to take action that led to a successful outcome. It was probably some unexpected event, and you felt completely thrown over your head and unprepared for what was to happen, and yet, nevertheless, something good came of it. You might have felt incompetent, but something good came of it. If you had chosen to be in that situation, if you had the choice, you wouldn't have been there, but you were in over your head, no getting out of it. Anybody have an image in their mind of experience like that? Almost all of us can think of a time that, oh my God, yeah, I remember. And the reason I say that is I use this when I talk about work with executives. Say that jazz players do that all the time. That's the litmus test for what a good performance is. Were you terrified enough? It's an interesting way to organize, isn't it? Can you believe I also work for the Navy? Isn't that funny? But the reason I say that is those moments tend to be self-defining moments. And this is what I meant when I said comparison, is that when we throw ourselves in over our heads, sometimes we discover that those are the moments where our identity comes to us, when we discover important things about ourselves. We're thrown in a comparatively different place. We discover who we are by noticing how we behave in unfamiliar situations. Well, here's the principles I want to go over now. But I want to bring out some of these points. The first is one of unlearning habits. The first task of every jazz player is to abandon habits or overcome competency traps. The second is an appreciative mindset. What I say yes to the mess. No matter where you are, no matter what kind of a junkyard you're in front of, say yes to it. The notion of minimal consensus and minimal structures that lead to that allow maximum autonomy. approach to errors as a source of learning rather than something to be eliminated, what I call provocative competence or incremental disruptions that demand an openness, alternating between soloing and supporting. And I'll say a word about that now in case I don't get to it during our time together. The other reason I like jazz is, especially in America, we put so much emphasis on individual achievement and talk about the leader as if it's an individual thing, this sort of homage we pay to the individual, this unit analysis, it's a heroic model. And when do we ever spend time talking about followership? What is a good follower? I mean, we don't even have theories for it. And the reason I say that, I think this is an interesting model, is I think jazz provides a good metaphor for what good followership is. In jazz, when there's a soloist, there's also others whose mission in life is to make that soloist happen. Comping is short for accompanying. It means you play chords or play the beat on the drum or the bass, and what you don't want to do is turn into another soloist, right? Because then there's only room for one soloist. So you want to play well, but not so well that you shine. So you try and guess and think what the other person's thinking. You listen to the solo and make that solo happen. Feed them ideas, back out and leave them space upon occasion. But you sort of surrender your ego to the idea, and the idea is king that the soloist is putting forth. Well, I want to talk first about this, mastering the art of unlearning. What makes jazz interesting is you deliberately create opportunities to surprise yourself. You develop these routines and habits, like you practice habits, but what you need to do is abandon them. You're always suspicious of your own competence. Once something gets to be too comfortable and you play it automatically, it becomes your enemy because it's very seductive. You can do it without thinking. I love this phrase from Miles Davis: "If it sounds clean and slick, I've been doing it too long." And by the way, it's one of the things, personal soapbox again, and one of the things I don't like about modern CDs is everything is perfect. Well, the music sounds so perfect. If you listen to live recordings from old jazz bands, there's lots of mistakes in there, and there's something about that sounds, it's more aesthetic to me for some reason. You can see people making decisions on the spot, or hear them making decisions on the spot. But the notion is, I remember learning once, Oscar Peterson was one of my favorite piano players when I was growing up, and I remember learning that Oscar Peterson is not highly regarded by other jazz players. I should be struck dead for criticizing Oscar Peterson. I mean, with one hand, he could do more than I could do with three hands, but he has incredible technique. But why do you think he was seen as not highly regarded as a jazz player? Yeah, he was very predictable, exactly. He was too good. He was, at the age of 25, he was playing with the superstars, with Charlie Parker and Lester Young. He was recording. And, at a certain point, he became trapped by his own success. He couldn't make mistakes. So when he was in his 40s and 50s, and he's a brilliant piano player, but you'd hear a solo, and he played the same lick he played, 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. And again, I'd say he's still a great player. But on the other hand, Sonny Rollins, the tenor saxophone player, he's regarded as the greatest living improviser by a lot of people. And why? Because sometimes he stinks. He's always trying to outdo himself. He says he always wants to try something he's never done before, and sometimes it's just incredible, and it's full of surprises. And other times it just falls flat in his face. It just doesn't. I've heard him several times, and almost every time it happens to be. I saw him at Ronnie Scott's in England, and I remember hearing him, and it was just amazing. I was just blown away by it. And I remember talking to one of the managers afterwards, and he said, "Yeah, but you should have been here last night. It was terrible." But the notion is, as if you stand in line for that. But the notion is that you want to throw yourself into the terror. Keep your habits, but be suspicious of them. Deliberately undo them. I love this one quote from Steve Lacy, just passed away a few months ago. Great saxophonist. But look at the language he uses to describe what it is to improvise. It's very common language. He says he likes it because it has something to do with being on the edge. You're on the brink of the unknown and get prepared for a leap, or you're on a limb hanging out over the edge of a cliff, and you just leap in and make it happen. He says, you can't get that from playing written music. That's why I like improvising, he says. Well, the notion is then if you're going to break habits and try and do something you've never done before, then you're going to create a lot of junk. The jazz players always find themselves in the middles of messes and chaos. So what's the mindset that makes it work? And this is the core one. It's what I call the appreciative affirmative competence, which is say yes to the mess. No matter what situation you're in, no matter what materials you got in front of you, this is the perfect moment now, and it's just the right material. I can find something to work. I don't know what it's going to be, but I can find something. That's the notion. So if you just attend closely to what's happening and then just jump in, for sure you find something to work. That's the crucial sense. Otherwise, if you're engaged in problem solving, your improvisation is going to fail. I mean, if you're playing and the saxophonist plays some phrase in a different key, you don't stop and say, geez, could you go back over that again? I don't really, I don't know wild about it. You just no, whatever that is, it's going to work. I'll find a way out. It's going to work. So that every utterance has affirmative potential. I think jazz band is a great model for hope, because they're organized with the sense that there's some, out of every motive, out of every cue, out of every utterance, something positive can happen, and probably something that's never happened before. Isn't that a great way to approach a collectivity? I mean, often, I wish I approached my department meetings that way, but I better stop there. Because this is on tape. But well, I want to just give an example, and I realized I didn't ask somebody. Was it Joellen? Is that your name? I'm sorry I didn't see. Could you come up and help me for a second? Thank you. Say yes to the mess, Joellen. I'm gonna just ask you to write down some notes on the flip chart if you can. You don't have to, not the bar, just the letter names. I'll do. What I'm going to do is go through there's a marker right there. I'm going to go through the chromatic scale. I'm going to play every note and ask you to just listen and close your eyes and listen and pick a note you like. People resonate with certain notes. I don't know if you know that. You hear a note and it has a resonance. We don't know why. Beethoven loved the key of E flat. All of his great works were in E flat. E flat. You don't have to pick E flat. I'm not trying to forward a particular note. But I'll just close your eyes and listen. I'll announce it and tell you, and you pick one. Ready? Here's C. D flat. D. E flat. E. F. G flat. G. A flat. A. B flat. B. And C. Okay, everybody get one? I have to go through that again? Okay, good. I wasn't going to go through it again. Okay, I'll give you, I'll tell you what. Hold on. Let's see. Scott, what was your note? C. Would you write C down, please? Thank you. What was your note? A. Would you write down? I'll come over to this side of the room for a second. What was your note? C. C, I'm going to hold off on that because we already have it. Robert? C as well. We'll hold off on the C's. F. F? Okay. This next one's the important one. Boy, oh boy. Who feels right? Who feels good? No volunteers for this. I got to pick on my own. And E flat. Oh, did you say? No, we're only doing 4. Hold on. No. For what you're paying me, you only get 4 notes. We'll say 4. Well, maybe I might add in A flat. We'll see. Well, anyway, that's good. Thank you, Joel. I appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, so in theory, the theory is that you say yes to the mess. It means no matter what junk is in front of you, you can make sense of it, that you can make it work. Huh? So I'm going to just try it out and see how it's going to work here. Oh, boy. I hate this part of the program. I'll just play it through once and just listen what we have. Not bad. Good choice, Ann. Try again. Okay, hum it so you can hear the note. Hum it with me. Great. Was that just the recovering Catholics, or did everybody join? You good? Close encounter. It does sound like close encounter, doesn't it? Well, let's just see. I'll try and talk amongst yourselves. Just to see what we have. So we just try things out and discard them on the spot. Well, thank you. Thank you. I want to thank Yoop for the piano, by the way. Yoop is responsible for bringing the piano here. Thank you. Well, you get a sense of, and hopefully, someday we should test this when we have a longer time. I only propose it when we don't have enough time, is to take the same 4 notes and see if you better come up with something completely different, right? And see what happens. But we don't have time for that. But that's the crucial moment is that say yes to the mess. You couldn't stop and say, geez, I wish that wasn't. I forgot about the A flat. Could have put that in as well. But the crucial moment is saying yes. Jazz players are in perpetual appreciative inquiry. They're asking each other questions all the time, saying, try this, try this, try this. And the answer is always yes, 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 yes. And otherwise, improvisation falls apart. It's all very tacit, but that's what keeps the glue together. I also think that's part of the answer to Dave's question, day one. What is it about seeing whole systems that transforms people? And when you put yourself in a mindset of say yes to the mess and say a tacit yes to every, we're always asking each other questions. We just don't always hear the question. Huh? So when you hear the question, people are really asking, and you're saying yes, you get these glimpses. And again, it's the notion is we have all the materials we need right here and right now to make something positive work, to make it work. One of the other ways, there is a structure to jazz, and I want to give an example of this as well. But it's a different kind of structure because structure is a loaded term. We often associate it with bureaucracies or command and control organizations, matrix structures or whatnot. But what makes jazz work is it's a minimal structure. It's just enough agreement to allow people to take off and depart, right? Now, I say that because it's counterintuitive. Especially all of us raised in the OD, we talk about building consensus and coming up to an agreement. We want to get the group to agree. In jazz, too much agreement is a bad thing. You don't want too much agreement. You want just enough. Now, even with these provocative propositions, it's nice that we all like them. It's also great that we all see them differently. We all have different interpretations, and some of them are contrary. That's a good thing in improvisation. You have the fact that the proposition lays out there, the fact that the structure is there, there's just enough agreement, overlap, that allows us to coordinate action and let each other go. I mean, I think if you want to ruin a good jazz band, bring in an OD consultant to do a team building session, huh? Could you imagine at the break going over, let's go over our vision for the next set. Now who's going to take the role of the leader? They'd be, get out of here. You don't want clarity on those things. It's impersonal. In fact, often jazz players, when they play together, they've never met, they don't know each other, they're on there for the first time, or sometimes they play together and they don't even like each other. They'll play and they'll play great, and you would think, they're great friends and stuff, but they don't even talk to each other off stage because it's irrelevant. When they're together, there's an intimacy that happens because they trust the music. Just enough of that structure allows the players to tacitly respond to each other on the spot. We tend in organizations to overstructure things, or we tend to structure things at the beginning real heavily and at the end real heavily, and in the middle of a project we're like, ooh, I don't know what's going on. But so jazz is maybe a good model for us to think about ways to coordinate through time, and with time as a variable. Another notion here is that the approach to errors, if you ask an organization to experiment and to try things you've never done before, you can be rest assured there's going to be plenty of mistakes. Right? If you're demanding experimentation, there will be errors. What makes jazz interesting is you don't want to eliminate errors. I mean, most organizations, we set up whole departments to get rid of errors. We train errors out. And we let go of people if they make too many errors. There's some really interesting work being done in studies of hospital teams. And they compared hospital teams in emergency rooms where it's okay for the emergency room people that work to talk openly about their mistakes. And then compared to other cultures where there's no tolerance for errors. Well, they discovered first the culture difference is incredible. Job satisfaction is amazing. But also, the number of errors goes down. When you're able to talk openly about making a mistake, the number of mistakes goes down. They get better and better at what they're doing. Well, in jazz, it's interesting because the approach to errors, errors are incorporated. If you make a mistake, what do? You just treat it as another piece of junk you got to work with. It's just like another note. It's another phrase. It's more material to be gleaned and explored for see where we can take it. In fact, what Miles Davis said, if you're not making a mistake, it's a mistake. So Herbie Hancock would play a chord on the piano, and Miles would take it real slow rubato and sort of elaborate on a theme. So Herbie would just play the chord, and then Miles would go, yeah, and then he'd wait, and then Herbie would hit the chord. Miles would play around it. And so one time, and Herbie's listening, and he hit the wrong chord. And it's right. This isn't like in a living room with your friends. This is like 10,000 people. And there's nothing. And he's hitting, and he goes like this. And he went like this. And he went, oh, shit. And he said he felt clammy all over, And so Miles was playing his horn. He looked over at him like this. And just played with that chord. He just played the notes in that chord. It was like saying, if this is what you're going to give me, this is what I'm going to work with. And he did this nice elaborate thing, and Herbie said, yeah, that sounds good. I meant to do that. So that's the notion is repeat it, amplify it, so you can learn from it. It's an occasion for learning. Now, I work regularly with Boeing aircraft, and I do these workshops on improvisation. And I remember I was a little gun-shy about talking about errors, well, partially because I was going to fly home on a Boeing plane the next day. And I didn't want to encourage anybody to be making mistakes on my plane. But I remember later at night, I was in a conversation with one of the executives. Listen to this. Just read that quote real quick. That's exactly what jazz players do. Repeat the error so they can learn from it in new ways and see where we go. And he said we get all kinds of insights. If we have a failure in part of the wing, we do everything we can to repeat it, amplify it, and we learn about all kinds of things in the system. Fascinating. There's other millions of examples. I'm sure you all know the Post-it note example coming from an unintended. Just because people are open to possibility, it's an occasion for learning. I think that is when we talk about that approach to errors. I think, and it is connected to destiny, I think it's a mindset of collective wisdom, isn't it? I mean, there's this notion, it's sort of ambidextrous, that on the one hand, you're taking action with no guarantee your action is the right thing. You see, some of us, introverts especially, would say, oh gosh, should I, shouldn't I, should I try it? Well, that's also not helpful to a system. Sometimes you just got to jump in and act. So what kind of mindset is a good mindset? Is that, there's this, you don't have excessive caution or excessive confidence, but you act with the awareness that there's other possibilities. There's this contingency that you act like you know what you're doing and simultaneously kind of doubt what you know, question what you know. I want to tie this to leadership here and give a couple examples from jazz, and then maybe one or two examples from real non-jazz organizations. What I call provocative competence as a leadership technique, and I think it's one of my favorite models for this is Miles Davis. When I say provocative competence, I mean this is a leader who takes a role in a group or organization to sort of explore and monitor the edge and competence of the people he's working with, he or she is working with. So the leader's job is to notice what's their learning edge. And everybody has a learning edge, right? An area of which they feel comfortable, competent, and then there's one increment beyond it. And left to our own devices often, we stay in the zone of safety. We don't want to risk that. But a real good leader will know how to set up a culture where he encourages people to go outside the zone of safety and turn it into a learning experiment, a learning experience. So often what they do is create these incremental disruptions that demand the interruption of habit and demand that you pay attention and learn. And pay attention to what unfolds. So Miles Davis was a great example of that. I'll just give a couple examples. He had a great quintet in the 1960s. He was playing with Herbie Hancock was on piano. Herbie Hancock was 23 years old. He had just discovered him, and his tenor saxophone player was a guy named Wayne Shorter. He was 22. His drummer was 17 years old, Tony Williams. He had just picked him up out of a high school jazz band contest. The old man of the group was Ron Carter. He was 29. They had never played together before. Miles heard them all individually. A couple of them had played. Wayne Shorter had played with Herbie. But he put this group together for the first time, and he said, well, let's see how it goes. And the first thing he says is, I forbid you to practice. And by the way, part of the mystique is the way Miles talked. Did you ever hear Miles Davis talk? There's a mystique connected to it. You just know it's something wisdom. He had a throat problem, so he said, there's no practicing on my band. It's like you think, woo, I'm not going to question that. But you can imagine what that means, because when you play together, and by the way, that band never had a rehearsal. They made something like 10 or 12 records, some of the greatest records in the history of jazz, still bestsellers. As far as jazz could ever be a bestseller. And no rehearsal ever took place with that group. Then he used to do little things, and why would he say no rehearsal? Yeah, because he wants you to be fresh. If you rehearse, then what you're playing on the bandstand is something you already did. You're a non-learner there. You're just showing up. You're doing for us what you learned yesterday. What do you look like when you're learning on the spot? And so he used to do little tricks to make sure to disrupt their habit and their comfort pattern. So he would do things like he would take a standard song, like they played a standard tunes. One real fairly well-known was "If I Were a Bell." Some of you might know that song. It's from the musical Guys and Dolls by Frank Lesser. And it was a standard song in jazz, and almost everybody plays it, and everybody plays it in the key of F. It was just, when you get together and you never met each other and you sit down to play, you say, "If I Were a Bell," you don't even say, what key, you just count it off. Everybody does it in F. So he'd be on the bandstand. He actually did this. He said, okay, let's do "If I Were a Bell." Let's go. Put it right there. 1, 2, 1, 2. Let's do this in D flat. And it's like, what? Herbie said, what? D flat? I don't even think in D flat, He said he stopped, and he didn't know what to do for a moment. He says, I never had to pay so much attention in my life. And you got to take action. I mean, it's not like there's another band in back that's going to play while you figure out where you are. You got to jump in and act and see where it goes. And he said, man, I never had to pay so much attention in my life. He said, my ears were listening, my elbow was listening, my nose was listening. He says, I never had to pay so much attention, and I played stuff I've never played before. I couldn't do my old licks. That's an example of provocative competence, where a leader sort of turns it into an appreciative system on the spot. You're going to be a learner now. But there's a trick to it, and that's why I call it competence. If a leader does that all the time, it's obnoxious, isn't it? You don't want to be with somebody it's an art. And the notion is do it just the right amount, and with the notion that you have a confidence that this person can do well in this situation. I want to give you one other quick example of this, and somebody actually requested this, a song I played last time when we were in Baltimore, because I think it exemplifies real well and turned out to be a historically significant moment in the history of music, actually. The year was 1959, and Miles was working with a quintet at the time of unknown musicians. And listen to these names that no one had heard of at the time except other jazz players. The tenor player was named John Coltrane. His alto player was Cannonball Adderley. His piano player was Bill Evans, who I think is probably the greatest jazz musician, certainly the greatest jazz piano player. America's answer to Debussy in some ways, a sense of harmony. No one had heard. He hadn't recorded a solo album yet, so he was a name unknown. The drummer's name was Philly Joe Jones, and the bass player's name was Paul Chambers. All of them went on to become very, very famous musicians. Miles comes in 1959. He had an open contract. He could make a recording anytime he wanted to. And he tells us, come to Monday at 2 o'clock, show up for this session. He had written down on there a sheet of paper, and he said, he had written it out that morning, and he said, we're not going to do any chord changes this time. We're going to, we'll play in the D Dorian mode, and we'll do this for 16 bars. Then we'll play half stuff up in the E flat Dorian mode and do that for 8 bars. Then we'll take it back to the D Dorian mode and do it for 8 bars, and then come back, do it over again, over and over, and just play solo on that for a while. He turned to the recording engineer and he said, hit it. And he turned to the player, let's go. There was no rehearsal, and the song that was recorded, and that whole album, was recorded with no rehearsals. It was all first takes. It became, since that time, that session has become very famous. It's called, the name of the record is Kind of Blue. It's the highest selling jazz album of all time. It was the first jazz album to sell 1 million copies. That's an example of provocative competence. And Miles Davis had, what made that leadership possible is he had an image of what they were capable of, but it's a disruption of the old ways of doing things, but just enough. I mean, if it was overly disruptive, it would have fallen apart. Like if he had said, okay, we're going to do these modes and we're going to switch instruments. And I'd be like, yeah, come on, It's like, come on. So that's what makes it an art, is pay so much attention that you see their capacity perhaps better than they see their own. And just so you know that there's examples of this in real life. I love this story from British Air. A number of years ago, British Air was having trouble with marketing and with customer service. And so they went off-site on a retreat, and all the executives were in a hotel trying to figure out what they're going to do to increase customer service. The vice president of marketing went around their hotel rooms, took out all their beds, and put airline seats in there. They came out with some remarkable innovations for comfort on an airplane. That's an example. That's provocative competence, isn't it? It's like, they wouldn't just, if you asked consensus to try this out in advance, they go, no, get out. No way, don't be so stupid. We'll come up with something. Provocative competence. Another example from the Navy, I'll just tell real quickly. Some of you who've served in the Navy know the Oscar drill. It's when you steer a big ship, it's very hard to turn it around. So when there's a man or a woman overboard, it's a life-threatening situation because you have to stir the ship around just the right way so you don't hit the person, right? And they get caught up in the blades. When big ship is tough, you do a figure 8, actually. And so they had a rubber dummy. It's called the Oscar. So they called it the Oscar drill. And every now and then they would be up on the bridge, and the captain, they'd throw it, and they'd go, Oscar! And somebody else's turn would have to come up. Young lieutenant commander would have to come up and steer the boat and try and do the figure 8. Well, the CO of this one ship, commander, was on, and he was saying, these guys are getting lazy. They've just run this drill so many times. So he looked at him on the bridge. He took off his shoes and socks, and he says, hey, guys, don't blow this one. And he jumped overboard. And boy, did they pay attention. That's an example of provocative competence. It's like disrupting, left to our own devices, we fall into competency traps. We do the same thing over and over again until we get better and better at doing the wrong thing. And if we think about living in an appreciative system that's open to wonderment and open to awe at every moment, sometimes it means creating a little bit of disruption, which is why sometimes we say, I don't like when we think appreciative inquiry means it's always happy talk, or everybody's always positive, or it's great. I've been doing appreciative inquiry in the Navy. We've done 9 summits, and it's an appreciative intervention, but not all the talk is happy talk. There's some tough issues people talk about. They talk about it from an appreciative mindset. They say yes to the mess, but it's not all, let's have this great hug. It doesn't happen there. And it doesn't happen in jazz players either. I've said enough about alternating between soloing and comping, but the notion that when and you think about this, when you think about self-organized system, if you have a self-organized system, not everybody can be the leader on every act. It's great to take turns. So, at some point, your mission, your whole mission in life is to make someone else brilliant, to make their idea work. I think that's a great model for, usually we think if you play really well, It creates great listening. People pay attention. But this suggests the opposite, is if you listen really closely, you help the person play better. So attentive listening creates great performance, the opposite of the usual arrow. I won't say anything about striking a groove now, except to say that it's the goal of every jazz performance. When you get to that point where everyone's locked in and attuned and paying attention. I could feel in this room, there were several times when this room was striking a groove. Where you just know that there's a sort of an ecstasy. You've just reached this level of attunement. And people talk about it as if they're at a higher level. They really use words like, they use spiritual words. They talk about it gliding or grooving. Like you say, out-of-body experience. Like I played beyond my level. You know, I did better than I could have in the past, and there's no way to predict it. But I think about, if we come back to what we've talked about so far these 4 days, think about some of the topics that were discussed when Diana talked about British Air and the notion of exceptional arrival experience. We're talking about destiny in an appreciative inquiry cycle. Exceptional arrival experience is just 4 notes asking you to embellish. It's like somebody lets loose this theme and say, let's branch off, and how are we going to make this work? Or the notion of think and act like an owner of the business. You know, the phrase driver account specialist that was out there. If we call you a driver account specialist, you know, the notion is let's get perfectly clear what this means. Here's the definition. Read this card. You don't want that. You want it's notes inviting embellishment, because gosh, what would a driver account specialist do? And this is, I'm going to close with this notion I talked about earlier, where I think we have to pay attention also to the listening. Creating appreciative questions, that's very important. It's an art, and we really, I think that's one gift we're giving to the world as a movement, is the art of creating provocative and appreciative questions. But something else happens, and that is the notion of listening. What kind of listening happens? Sometimes you have to listen to statements and assume that they're questions. Well, I'll say one other thing is when the listening is happening, when there's attunement among any set of human beings, there's no rules. You don't need rules. When listening stops, that's when people put rules in place. Huh? But when listening is present, you don't need rules about how to behave. Here's the structure or whatnot. The other theme I want to raise quickly about what happens with jazz is this notion of forgiveness. Is if you're going to have a self-organized system, if you're going to let loose an appreciative system, you also have to forgive people for trespassing. People will make mistakes. There'll be error of reach. They'll exceed what was previously thought of as possible. And what's going to make this work is jazz players are great at forgiving each other on the spot. And I'm inspired by this by David Bright, a graduate student at Case Western Reserve, who's doing his dissertation on forgiveness, if any of you get a chance to speak with him. No, I think we're done. Great, thank you. Thanks, everybody.